is John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to another day of Kaladesh previews. And we have a lot of cards to look at today. Now, as we're getting closer to the end of spoiler season for this set, things are starting to wind down a little bit. We actually have some really cool cards to look at today, but you're going to notice we have a lot of cards that are really there for the limited format as well. Now, we have 28 cards to look at today, so I'm going to try to go a little bit quicker today so the video doesn't take forever. Just a quick reminder before we get started, check out the description below for a link to our Amazon affiliate store, and if you make any purchases through those links, a small percentage will come back to help support the channel, to help us make better videos in the future. So having said that, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day, and that's the 28 new cards. Alright, first we have Aviator Mechanic. It's a white and 1 dwarf artificer, common. When this enters the battlefield, you may return another permanent you control to its owner's hand. It's a 2/2. This is basically a limited bounce card that's hopefully going to give you a little bit of advantage with an enter the battlefield effect. It is still a 2/2 for 2, which is very, very playable and limited, and I've said this many times in the past, but the 2-drop spot is probably your most important spot in your curve when you play limited, so sometimes you just need 2 drops. So if that's the case, this is there for you, but this becomes much, much better if you have some really good enters the battlefield effects. And that could include fabricate cards, that could include cards that give you energy when they enter the battlefield. There are definitely a lot of targets for this thing in Kaladesh. I don't think you'll have a hard time finding 1 or 2. Next we have Captured by the Consulate. 1 white and 3. It's an enchantment or a rare. Enchant creature you don't control. Enchanted creature can attack. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, if it has a single target, change the target to enchanted creature if able. And I also want to point out this is the second story spotlight card that we've seen so far. So I think this is decent in limited for you. It's not a true pacifism effect. The creature can attack, which is nice, but it can still block, so you want to remember that. What you're getting instead, though, is this sort of awkward ability that forces your opponent to hold off their removal spells, or just simply bite the bullet and play their first spot removal spell on their own creature. It also messes up with their combat tricks, where the only creature that they can target with their combat trick, as long as it's targeting a single creature, is this one. So it does slow them down. It kind of takes away their momentum a little bit. And for that reason, it could be decent for you in the right situation. Now, you do have to take into account, though, there's a ton of flicker effects in this set, there's a ton of bounce effects in this set, and there's also things that are going to target multiple creatures and not just one creature that they can still find value out of. So it's not a be-all, end-all fantastic removal spell for white by any means, but it can tempo your opponent a little bit. I think that's how you want to look at this card when you evaluate it. You have to take into account it might not stick around very long, right? You could find some value out of it, especially if your opponent is forced to destroy their own creature. I mean, that's kind of nice for 4 mana. That's not always going to happen, though. You just have to think to yourself, okay, I want to deal with one attacker that's threatening to me for maybe a couple turns while I can find another way to deal with it. That's probably what you're going to use this card for more than anything. Next we have Impeccable Timing. 1 white and 1. It's an instant common, and this deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Very good card in limited. There's a lot of small creatures in this set. We've seen them previewed throughout the last couple weeks, and this is a way that you can deal with them for 2 mana at instant speed. Sure, it's not unconditional. They have to be attacking or blocking, so it won't deal with a creature that's being held back for an ability or something like that, but it does deal with a lot of the aggressive creatures that are trying to get in the red zone, especially in the Boros colors. You'll be happy to play 1 or 2 of these in your limited deck. As far as standard goes, this potentially could see some play in standard, maybe out of the sideboard, but I do think it's strong enough. If white needs something like this, it could potentially get the call up. Refurbish. 1 white and 3, sorcery, uncommon, return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is maybe one of the more interesting cards of the day because it takes something directly from the graveyard and puts it right into the battlefield. Of course, in this case, an artifact. So that can do a few different things for you. For example, you have a good artifact or good artifact creature you want to return, or if there's a way to maybe reanimate a really big expensive artifact creature, that could get kind of interesting. We're actually going to look at a large artifact creature a little bit later in this list, so maybe there's a combo there which potentially could even show up in limited, and I think maybe even standard. You also have to keep in mind in standard right now, because of all the Shadows over Innistrad cards, you do have the ability to mill yourself, you have the ability to discard cards, so there's a lot of ways to populate your graveyard. This could become a tool that works well with that style of deck. So watch out for that in the future. I think this has some strong potential. As long as someone can brew something that's efficient enough, this does have strong potential for standard play. Once you get outside of standard and you start looking at modern or even legacy, I think there's better options out there for like reanimation tricks and stuff, so I don't know if it would cross over there, but certainly possible in standard. Sky Whaler shot. 1 white and 2, it's an instant uncommon, destroy target creature, power 3 or greater, scry 1. First off, great in limited. You'll be very, very happy to play this in your limited deck. Even a couple of these, you'll find value. It doesn't deal with small creatures, sure, but it deals with large creatures or larger creatures, and it also lets you scry on top of it, and it does it all at instant speed. That's pretty awesome. As far as standard goes, the power level feels good that this is standard playable. The only thing that's awkward right now about this card is the biggest creature that you'd probably want to get rid of with this thing is Emrakul, and unfortunately that has protection from instants. So you're probably going to start trying to think of maybe sorcery removal in the current meta anyway. Of course that could change when the set comes out. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I think for the most part, the fact that this is an instant, which is usually a plus, may hold it back a little bit in the current standard meta anyway. So we'll have to kind of wait that out and see how it pans out. But at least in the future down the road, I mean, the power levels here, this could be standard playable. Aether Squall Ancient. 2 blue and 5, it's a Leviathan rare, 6/6 flyer. At the beginning of your upkeep, you get 3 energy counters, pay 8 energy, return all other creatures to their owner's hand, but activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So this is a big creature. I feel like it's a little too big for standard, even though it does have some big effects tied into it, but it does give you a 6/6 flyer and 3 energy, which makes me feel like this is going to be a bomb in limited, right? It's a little more expensive. I mean, getting up to 7 mana, we'll have to see how easy that is in the world of Kaladesh. I feel as if Kaladesh does have some aggressive cards, but there's also a lot of ways to slow the game down too, so I feel like getting to 7 mana pretty reasonable, at least it appears at this point. Granted, we haven't seen the whole set yet, so this is probably something you could run at the top of your curve and sealed or even draft and I think be okay. Once you get this on the board, your opponent's got to deal with it or else it's just going to be game over. As far as the second ability goes too, that can also be very relevant and limited, especially towards the late game if you have some other energy production cards in your deck. Now, one of the reasons I don't think this is going to make it into standard, aside from the casting cost, is you do have cards out there right now like Crush of Tentacles, so there's other ways to do similar things that are going to be a little cheaper. Next we have a card that comes to us from a German language spoiler, and loosely translated, it's Disappearing Act. It costs 2 blue and 1, it's an instant. As an additional cost to cast Disappearing Act, return a permanent you control to its owner's hand, counter target spell. This is very intriguing to me because the design here, very, very elegant considering the situation. So let's look at this card first at face value. It's a cancel with downside. And you may say to yourself, wow, how did we get here? Like, at what point did we decide cancel was too good that we have to put a drawback on it, right? Like, we're kind of used to the 2 mana counter spells having a drawback, but wow, now cancel has a drawback. But you have to also think in this set, in this world, at least in limited, this drawback could be used potentially as an advantage. You have a lot of really good enter the battlefield effects in this set. I mean, we just saw an enchantment that locks down a creature, so a case like that, you could return your creature to your hand and that enchantment would go away. That would be nice. But probably more often what you'll see are things like maybe you want to bounce something that has fabricate on it and play it again. Maybe you want to bounce a card that's going to give you energy when it returns to the battlefield. There's just so many great enters the battlefield effects. I mean, even look at the Gearhulks. I mean, they all have great effects attached to them. So all of a sudden, what really appears to be a drawback maybe is upside to this card. So you got to think of it this way. However, when evaluating the card, you do have to look at it kind of in a vacuum and kind of say to yourself, well, how many targets do I actually have in my deck, right? So to sum it up, in limited, I think this is still a good card for you. Even if you just have to get around the quote-unquote drawback by maybe returning a land to your hand, that's not too bad. At least they give you the option of permanent, not like creature or something like that. So that opens up a lot of your options. Now, if you also happen to have a lot of good enters the battlefield effects in your limited deck, then this card becomes that much better. As far as standard goes, I don't know if it's going to quite get there. I mean, if there is some control deck that also has some great enters the battlefield effects and they want to run this, well, maybe. But for the most part, I don't really see this winning out over, say, Scatter to the Winds or something like that at this point, right? So a card to keep an eye on. Not to say it's unplayable in Standard. Again, there could be a deck that's looking to do something like this, but at the very least, I think it will be decent for you in Limited. Experimental Aviator. This costs 2 blue and 3, Human Artificer. Is an uncommon 0/3 creature. When this enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying. So it feels a tad expensive, but you are getting some value here. I mean, 2 flyers is pretty good. Now, when do you want to play this card? This card gets much better if you can flicker it or even bounce it. Just any way that you can exploit that enters battlefield effect really adds a lot of value to this card, because giving yourself a 0/3 flyer for 5 and a couple 1/1s, that's okay, but if you can give yourself 4 Thopter tokens, that's very good. If you can give yourself 6 Thopter tokens, now we're talking about taking over the game, right? So this is the type of card that you really want to play with flicker effects or even bounce effects. It will just get so much better in that situation. Now, as far as Standard goes, unfortunately, I think considering this costs 5 and it really takes some other cards to make it better, I think the level of inconsistency is going to be a little too high for it to cross over there, but I do think it's a very, very good limited card in the right deck. Longfin Sky Whale. 2 blue and 2. This is an uncommon whale. 4/3 with flying and can only block creatures with flying. Another good limited creature. I mean, sometimes you're in a weird situation where you're behind and you top deck this and it can't block and it's going to hurt, and we've all been there. But at the same time, putting a 4/3 flyer on the battlefield and letting it attack in a lot of times is enough to win a game even. So it's a powerful enough effect. It's not going to help you if you're behind, but hopefully with cards like this you won't get behind. You'll be able to stay on the offensive at least a good portion of the time. So definitely worth running in Limited. Nimble Innovator. 1 blue and 3, Vidalcan Artificer, common, 2/2. And when this enters the battlefield, draw a card. So paying 4 for a 2/2, even if it does replace itself, doesn't feel like it's quite there for me. However, if I can flicker it or I can bounce it, it starts to add value to this card. So again, limited playable, but it has to be the right deck. You have to make sure you have cards that synergize with this well. If you do, then yeah, go ahead and run one of these and it will be fine for you. But if you don't have enough ways to really exploit the enter the battlefield effect, you probably want to leave this one in your sideboard. Tezzeret's Ambition. 2 blue and 3. It's a sorcery, common. Draw 3 cards. If you control no artifacts, discard a card. So let's talk about limited first. I feel like most of the time you'll probably have an artifact by the time you get to the point where you can cast this card. There's so many cheap artifacts in the set. It just feels like most of the time you'll be able to get the full value. And even if you don't, I think it's still going to be okay for you. Having said that, these 5 casting cost, draw 3 effects are usually pretty good in Limited. You don't mind running one of these. I mean, you don't want to muck up your deck with them. Don't get crazy because they are common. Can be a tad expensive. You don't want to draw all these in your opening hand, right? So a 1 of is usually pretty good just to keep things moving as you get to the mid to the late game. As far as Standard goes, sometimes these things do see Standard play as well. It just depends on what the meta looks like. If there's a classic style control deck out there at some point, this could run 1 or 2 of these as some additional card draw. It's possible, but it does take a very specific deck to want this. Weldfast Wingsmith. A blue and 3, Human Artificer, common, 3/3, and whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, this will gain flying until end of turn. This is a very good limited creature, I think, because it does have Hill Giant stats, 3/3 for 4, which blue doesn't always get, first off. Now, on one hand, the old school player in me kind of says, wow, this feels like a Phantom Monster with downside, right? And I guess technically it is, but let's face it, we're not going to see Phantom Monsters, other than maybe Eternal Masters, where it was reprinted, in our Standard environment sets anymore. But this is still good. I mean, this is an aggressive creature for blue. You don't always see blue getting a creature that's this strong for that casting cost. And then, okay, I play a cheap artifact and it gets flying till end of turn. And again, I can also exploit some flicker effects with my artifacts or something like that, or with the artifact creatures, and it gets a bonus. This plays really well with Fabricate, for example, too. I can play the Fabricate card, put the servo tokens onto the battlefield, and this gets flying. So this will be really good. It's going to be better in some builds than other builds, right? The more you can exploit the flying, the better. But still, a 3/3 for 4 in Limited is going to be sometimes just good enough. Ambitious Aetherborn, black and 4, Aetherborn Artificer, 4/3 Fabricate 1. Very simple card, and it's just a good limited beater. There's not a whole lot to say about it. I mean, you pay 5 and you get yourself maybe a 5/4, or else you get yourself a 4/3 and a 1/1 servo token. You want the servo token if you're trying to play either into a wide strategy or a situation where artifacts matter, like the last card we saw, or maybe you're playing with vehicles and you're using them to pilot your vehicles. So there's a lot of reasons why you go with a smaller creature and the token, but what's nice is you have the choice, and that does mean a lot sometimes. Weaponcraft Enthusiast, 1 black and 2, Aetherborn Artificer, uncommon, 0/1 Fabricate 2. Another good limited card. You get yourself possibly a 2/3 for 3. Those are good stats. Or if you rather go wide, you get 2 1/1 tokens and a 0/1 for 3. Definitely the power level's there for what you're paying for it. Just fine for you in limited. You'll be happy to run it. Brazen Scourge, 2 red and 1. This is a gremlin, uncommon, 3/3 haste. Now here's a card that really wants to battle. This is a fighter. You put this down and you're all in on aggro if you're playing this card, right? So this will be great for you in limited, especially in the more aggressive builds where you're just trying to get a lot of damage across fast. But potentially this one could see some standard play. I do feel like we will see more aggressive builds coming into standard at some point soon, and this card could get there in those situations. I do think Boros, maybe it will be the aggressive colors going forward. We'll have to kind of wait and see, and of course we still have a lot more cards to see in this set, so that's important too to take into account. But I do think overall, at least at some point, a card like this definitely could make it into an aggressive standard deck. Next we have Cathartic Reunion, 1 red and 1. It's a sorcery common. As an additional cost to cast this, discard 2 cards, draw 3 cards. So sometimes in limited, it's nice to have one of these in your deck. You get to the point in the mid to late game where you're drawing too many lands. If you can get a hold of this, then you can dump those lands and hopefully get some more action into your hand. So that's one use for it. The one other use, though, that I think could be really good is potentially Modern Dredge. I feel like this card could slide right into that deck, and that's a deck that's been doing very, very well, and it's becoming more and more popular. So another tool that could perhaps make that deck even better is very intriguing. So I'd want to test it out and see if it works well in that deck, but I feel like it could. So this could be another tool for that particular build. Chandras pyrohelix. Costs 1 red and 1. It's an instant common. It deals 2 damage divided as you choose among 1 or 2 target creatures and or players. Very good limited card. We've seen this type of thing before. It's always very good. It just gives you a lot of options. You can take out a couple 1 toughness creatures. You can take out a 2 toughness creature. You can split the damage between a 1 toughness creature and an opponent. You can just hit your opponent for 2. It just does so many things. It just depends on the situation. You'll be happy to run 1, even 2 of these in your deck. It can do some work for you. I think it's especially good in this limited environment because you do have a lot of servo tokens and possibly Thopter tokens running around. So this will really knock out a few Thopter tokens, which could be a big deal. Also, it could take away some vehicle pilots, which also could be a big deal. Demolish. 1 red and 3. It's a sorcery common. Destroy target artifact or land. Here's the thing about Demolish. We're almost numb to this card, I think, at this point. It shows up so often. It's like every couple sets they throw in the Demolish. Most of the time we don't even bother playing with it. It just sits in our sideboard, right? However, a couple things about this Demolish. First off, the art is incredible, and I love the gremlin demolishing the thing on the card. That's phenomenal. Secondly, we're in a very different environment now where Demolish actually becomes a little bit better because there's just a lot more artifacts, artifact creatures. There's a lot more things to do with it, and it makes a little more sense at the 4 spot than maybe it did in the last couple sets that we've seen it in. So now I feel like this is a more playable limited card than it was the last time, right? So keep that in mind when you see it. Don't immediately discount it if it's a card that you normally don't play with. Think about the world of Kaladesh and how this is probably a little bit better now. Next card comes to us from a Russian language spoiler. Loosely translated, it's Creative Spark. Costs a red. It's a sorcery. Choose target creature. Exile the top card of your library. You may have Creative Spark deal damage to that creature equal to the converted mana cost of the exiled card. If you don't, you may play that card until end of turn. So one interesting thing, first off, about Russian translation of these cards. Russian translation doesn't have a different word for cast and play. So we're assuming this is play, though, because typically if it's cast, it will say play the card, but then we'll have a little clause saying that you can't play the land if you've already played a land that turn. So it appears this is truly play that card. So that's important when evaluating this card, I think. Overall, there's a very high level of variance with this card, and I think that's what you have to keep in mind. There's so much that could go wrong. Now, it's very cheap. It only costs 1 red, so it's got that going for you. But at the same time, like, you can't count on this being removal, right? I mean, the odds that you're going to flip the right thing at the right time to take out the right creature are probably against you for the most part. So don't put this in your deck thinking I'm covered for removal, right? Because you're not. Secondly, flipping the card, and if you're not using it for removal, if you're hoping to basically get a card draw out of it, you got to remember this. It's not truly card draw because you're really just exchanging this card for that card. And you may or may not be able to play that card that you flip. And that's awkward. So you're almost better off in that case just not even having this card in your deck, and you would have drawn the next card anyway, right? If that makes sense. You would just have replaced this with something else that maybe would have been something you could have just cast. So having said that, I feel like this card's a little bit of a trap. It seems cool. Like, it seems like, wow, I could maybe turn this into something that I could cast right away, or perhaps, just be able to keep the land in my hand, flip another land and play that land. Feels like there's some sort of advantage here, but at the same time, when you think about it, you're just truly exchanging this card for hopefully something else, which could miss. And when it comes to removal, like I said, not reliable there either. So I kind of want to try this card out. It just seems intriguing. I guess maybe the gambler in me wants to play around with it. But at the same time, I don't think it's a really good card. It might be a card that you leave in your sideboard in limited. Reckless Fireweaver, a red and 1 human artificer. This one's common, 1/3. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, this will deal 1 damage to each opponent. This card's interesting to me. First off, good limited card. I mean, 1/3 for 2, that's very good. Nice little blocker. And there's a lot of artifacts. Every time you play one, you damage your opponent. Works great with Fabricate, especially if you're planning on throwing a lot of servo tokens down on the battlefield, or other cards that are giving you Thopter tokens. Just partners really well with those cards. This stacks very nicely. It's a common. You might be able to draft 3, maybe if you're lucky 4 of these things, and all of a sudden a couple end up on the battlefield and they'll stack very, very well for you. So this feels like a really good common in this set. Now, outside of limited, I do think there's some other interesting implications for this card. For example, you could create an endless loop that would just basically end the game. And it's interesting that it deals damage to each opponent, because if you're in a multiplayer game, it actually takes everybody out if you can create an endless loop. So an example of that would be if you had a card like Enduring Renewal and a 0 casting cost artifact creature like an Ornithopter and something to sacrifice it to while this card's on the battlefield. You just basically won the game. You just simply sacrifice the Ornithopter, it goes back to your hand, you play it, sacrifice it, goes back to your hand, you play it, and it just hits everybody for whatever their life totals are, right? So that Fruity Pebble style combo is definitely playable in things like Cubes or Commander, and I do think maybe someday that deck could even become a thing in Modern. As more and more cards come out, there's more ways to make that deck and make those combos more effective. So maybe it's not today, but sometime in the future, I wouldn't be shocked to see somebody try to pull a combo deck like that off in Modern at some point. So just something to think about. But yeah, it's a good card regardless in Limited, as well as maybe some other formats like Commander. Attune the Ether, 1 green sorcery common. Search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, shuffle your library, and you get 2 energy. This is basically a way to get some early energy. So if you have the deck that's trying to build up energy for some big payoffs, this is a good card to start. It's also going to make sure that your land drops keep coming, so that's actually pretty valuable as well. It is a sorcery, not an instant, but because you're getting the 2 energy out of the deal, I think that's good enough. So good for limited decks that are trying to exploit the energy mechanic. Highspire Artisan, green and 2, Elf Artificer. This is a common 0/3 with a reach and Fabricate 1. So a nice little blocker. It can come into play as a 1/4 with a reach. That's actually pretty good to deal with a lot of the small aggressive creatures, especially some of the flyers out there. And if you're not going that direction, you can go with a 0/3 reach, which is still a good blocker. And you also get your 1/1 servo token, which could be used for a whole lot of other things. So yet another good limited card. Next we have Oviya Pashiri, Sage Lifecrafter, 1 green, 1/2 creature. This is a legendary creature, human artificer, rare. Couple abilities. First one, pay a green and 2 and tap, create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. Pay a green and 4 and tap, Create an XX colorless construct artifact creature token where X is the number of creatures you control. So this card jumps out to me as something that would be amazing in Commander, especially if you have a token deck, like a go wide deck in green. This could actually be pretty awesome. The card's a little slow, I think, for like say Standard or something like that for what it's trying to do, and the fact that it taps kind of hurts it a little bit too, because really what I want to do with this card is have 6 mana and put out like 2 tokens at a time, right? But I can't really do that because it taps. Having said that though, fantastic in Commander, I think, if that's what you're trying to do. You could start making some really big creatures if you have a whole bunch of tokens on the board, or you can just make yourself some more tokens. You can do that too. This could be a Commander. It's legendary and it's cheap. Sometimes it's fun to play cheap Commanders. This also works in the world of tiny leaders, so if you're looking for a different tiny leader to try out, this could be one. Yeah, I really like what they did with this card. It just seems like a lot of fun. It might be more for casual players, but I think there's a lot you could find to do with it. I do think it's also very good and limited for you. It's a 1-drop. It has 2 toughness for a 1-drop. That's actually pretty good. And then even if it does nothing else but create a couple servo tokens, that's a fair amount of value to get out of a 1-drop in limited. So I think it's very playable there as well. Maybe my favorite card of the day just because of the just overall feel of it. Next we have Restoration Gearsmith, a black, a white, and 2 human artificer, uncommon, 3/3, and when this enters the battlefield, return target artifact or creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this kind of has a feel of a Gravedigger, except this time around you can choose between a creature or artifact to return to your hand. The give and take is it does cost 1 white mana instead of just all black mana to do it, but you're still getting yourself a decent sized creature. 3/3 for 4 is fine in limited. That's just great, and you hopefully will get a little bit of card advantage too out of it by taking a card back from your graveyard to your hand. So I do like this. I think it's very, very limited playable as long as you can swing the color qualifications. Next we have Metalwork Colossus. I alluded to this one earlier. Costs 11, artifact creature construct rare, 10/10. This will cost X less to cast, where X is the total converted mana cost of non-creature artifacts you control. Sacrifice 2 artifacts, return this from your graveyard to your hand. So a couple things with this card. First off, I talked about Refurbish earlier. Yes, this combos very well with Refurbish. If you're able to get this into your graveyard, play Refurbish for 4, put it into the battlefield, that's a beating, right? So where can you really pull that off? I don't know how easy that will be in limited. We'll have to see more of the set to see how easy it will be to, say, discard cards. It's obviously not as easy as the Shadows over Innistrad block, right? But if you can get this into your graveyard, that can be a really strong play in limited. But aside from that, I mean, granted, this is a rare. You're not going to see it that much. But when you do have it, even if you don't have Refurbish to go along with it, it's still very, very castable. I mean, just play a bunch of smaller artifacts. I mean, maybe some equipment. Now notice they can't be artifact creatures. If there's some strong equipment in the set that is playing well with your smaller creatures to help you get through the early game, and then they allow you to cast this maybe to the mid to late game, that could be quite strong as far as a strategy, right? So I really like that a lot. Also, if it does end up in your graveyard, hopefully you'll have a lot of like servo tokens and stuff running around that you can sacrifice to put it back in your hand and hopefully be able to play it again. Because remember, if you sacrifice artifact creatures, it doesn't really change the ability to cast this easier anyway. So that's pretty cool. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of manipulate this card, and I mean a 10/10, that's very, very strong. Granted, it doesn't have evasion, but you know what, once you're into double-digit power toughness, who cares? Your opponent's got to deal with this thing. Eventually it's just going to beat them down through attrition, even if they keep chump blocking the thing, right? So very cool card. I love the art on it too, with this creature in the city. It's like huge. Just the perspective is amazing. So yeah, very good card in limited. You'll be very happy to play it there, as long as you have enough small artifacts to make this come out a little bit easier out of your hand. If you don't, then maybe you skip it, because 11 is very, very high, but I think in this set you won't really have a problem putting together a few good equipment pieces or something like that. I think in standard someone might be able to brew that Refurbish combo up. I'd like to see it. I feel like that's one of those things that it's not super complicated to pull off, and someone may come up with something. If it's efficient enough, who knows, it could make it into standard. So something to keep an eye out for. Now other areas like modern or legacy or something like that, there are other Colossuses that are already out there, so I feel like for the most part those already kind of cover this base, so I don't know if it's going to see a lot of play outside of possibly standard, but it's still a cool cube card and commander card as well. Perpetual Timepiece. This costs 2. It's an uncommon artifact. You can tap it to put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, and you can pay 2 and exile this to shuffle any number of target cards from your graveyard into your library. This card is one of those cards that a classic control deck would really like to have. So if there is that style deck in Standard, it could potentially run this. That deck really likes to run a card like this so that they don't deck themselves. They're finding a lot of ways to draw cards and kind of go through their deck, and it gets to the point where they start running low on cards. They can play something like this and just completely restock. And we haven't seen a deck like that in Standard probably since the Sphinx's Revelation style deck back in like the Return to Ravnica time. And I don't really think we're going to see a deck quite like that probably ever again in Standard, because it was a little bit too slow and methodical. So having said that, I don't know if this will really find a home for that second ability. Now the first ability does play well with some of the decks we currently see in Standard, some of the Delirium style decks and such. Would they potentially want something like this? Maybe. So I guess that remains to be seen. You'd want to kind of test that and see how efficient it is, but potentially it could see some play there. It's very possible. Now, as far as limited goes, I don't really know if there's a strategy that wants you to mill yourself. Again, we haven't seen the whole set, so I guess we'll know more come Friday. But offhand, I can't really think of something where I would feel great about running this. Everything feels maybe a little too high variance. Like, for example, if I was trying to pull off like the Colossus refurbished combo and try to get the Colossus like milled, that's just a lot of luck whether you're going to hit that or not. So that feels a little awkward to me. So I can't really think of anything. But if someone thinks of something, definitely put it in the comments below. Next we have Prophetic Prism, costs 2, it's an artifact, common. When this enters the battlefield, draw a card. Pay 1 and tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this replaces itself, that's good. Keep in mind, it's not a true mana rock though, it's more of a color fixing card. So if you need to fix your color, if you're going really deep with color, this is a common. You might be able to get a couple of these if necessary. It's there for you. If you need it for that, there it is. Other than that, if you're not going super deep with color, this one will sit in your sideboard. Torch Gauntlet, and this is actually our last card of the day. Costs 2, it's an equipment, it's a common, and the creature will get +2/+0, and the equip cost is 2. So this actually does play very well with some cards we saw earlier in the week. We've seen a couple different cards now that get a buff if you control an artifact, and they're cheap creatures, 1-drops as a matter of fact. So if you play something like this on turn 2, they automatically get bigger. Then by turn 4, you can also equip this onto them, they get even bigger. So there's definitely some value to be had here. Now, it doesn't give them evasion, unfortunately, or trample or anything like that. So I'm kind of holding out to see what other equipment cards are going to be out there. I mean, I assume this is what we can expect from the common level, but maybe there'll be a better piece of equipment at uncommon or perhaps rare. And that might play even better with those cards. But in a vacuum, though, in limited, if you have 1 or 2 of those cards and you have this, you could have yourself a pretty nice little mini combo on your hands and get in there for some damage. Again, it's another cheap artifact, and I think there's something to be said in this set for having some cheap artifacts on the battlefield. They do seem to enhance other cards as well. And this one, being equipment, I think has a little more value than just kind of a random 2-drop artifact. So having said that, wow, those are the cards for today, and there were quite a few there. So we have one more day of spoilers to get through, and that's tomorrow, which is Thursday. So we'll be back tomorrow with another video, and we'll look at all the cards that come out within the next 24 hours. And then Friday, we're going to start the full set review with all of the white cards. So can't believe we're almost up to the set review. This set has been amazing. I'm looking forward to seeing the complete set revealed on Friday. Hey, but until then, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks as always for watching. This video, like all my videos, was made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Even a donation of $1 helps me to keep growing this community and creating better quality content for all of you. Check out our Patreon page for exclusive giveaways and future goals for the channel. If you haven't yet had a chance to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the MTG news, spoilers, set reviews, product openings, or finance videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.